Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Bridging the Divide, a virtual symposium on how we can best bring firearm owners and non-owners to work together to promote health and reduce gun violence. Today, we're going to be covering a lot of ground. We're going to start with an overview of 97% and why we started the organization and some of the recent research findings that we have. We're then going to do 4 panels. We're going to be talking about, for the first 2, how we can translate gun policy research that many of us have done into action. Initially, talking about how we take action at the federal level and some of the success that's been had. And then how do we do it at the state and local level? And again, some of the success that we've had. We're then going to talk about some of the work that's been done to bridge the divide between gun owners and non-gun owners. And we're going to end the day talking about how we create more effective policy to promote gun violence prevention. We have a number of great speakers today, including Dr. Michael Siegel, who's going to help moderate the event today. And we're excited to share and collaborate some of the great work that's been done over the last few years and some of the success that we're going to have going forward and how we can operate in the current environment despite some of the polemics that are happening at the federal and even the state level, and how we can work together to reduce gun violence. I wanted to start talking a little bit about 97% and how and why we started the organization. So if we can go to the next slide. Everybody on this call and most people in America and quite frankly around the world know that in America we have an epidemic of gun violence. And that problem is never more clear than when we have mass shootings. For the group at 97%, we were, like everybody else, struggling with the basic situation when at every mass shooting, you have a rise in awareness about gun violence, you have an outcry from the public, and yet there had been very little movement at the state or federal level. And so for Stacy Miller, my co-founder, and I, we were most impacted by the fact that at these school shootings in particular, we had children of the same age as some of the children that were killed in these school shootings. And that was true for us both at Newtown and at some of the other shootings where our kids were growing up in a world of gun violence. And we felt like we needed to act. So we started doing research on why has this been such an intractable problem? Why does it seem like following each shooting, there are so many people that are ready to take action, and yet that action doesn't seem to be taken? So we did something a little bit unique, which is we hired a marketing firm, actually. And so if you go to the next slide, we looked at purple states and tried to understand through the marketing firm what were the opinions and attitudes of people in the purple states around various gun policies and with regard to gun safety. And we intentionally went to purple states because we wanted to understand not just what non-gun owners thought, but in particular, what did gun owners think? And we were very surprised by the results because in a world where there seems to be extreme opposition on so many topics, including around gun safety and the use of firearms, what we found was that there was almost total agreement on what kind of action should be taken and what was needed. And so we thought, well, maybe these results are not correct. So we dug in, we did more research, and what we found is that the policies around gun safety and the desire to reduce gun violence and to keep firearms out of the hands of people with a known violent background were almost universally agreed upon. In fact, this was one of the areas that, despite what we saw in the press, despite what you read, despite all the rhetoric, this was one of the areas where there was the most agreement, not the least agreement. And we realized that there was something missing from the equation, something missing from most of the conversation. And that, if you go to the next slide, was the fact that gun owners weren't really part of the conversation. So even though gun owners, when polled, especially when asked anonymously, would agree on many of the policies that people were discussing, when you read the news, that was not the case. And so we did exhaustive research with academic institutions, with other gun safety organizations. We spoke to community groups, to law enforcement, and to elected officials across the spectrum. And what we found was that gun owners needed to be brought into the conversation. They simply were not part of the discussion about reducing gun deaths. And so in 2021, we launched 97%. Go to the next slide. And our mission was simply to reduce gun deaths in America by changing the conversation. And the way we wanted to change the conversation was to bring gun owners into that conversation, to make it clear that there was not this massive rift across the country. This was not a division on red and blue lines. In fact, it wasn't a division between gun owners and non-gun owners. There was tremendous agreement, and that if we could conduct original research, if we could promote the truth about agreement around this topic, and we could dig into the details, into the nuances to understand how do we have common ground, that we could perhaps move the needle. And so our organization has been focusing on training and on communication of the results and on a tremendous amount of research to understand where is there disagreement, because there's some, and how do we bridge the divide between gun owners and non-gun owners, between the right and the left, to bring together common sense policies that work for everybody, that would have tremendous support across the country and would enable us to have a safer policy and a safer community around the nation. And that was the birth of 97%. Go to the next slide. Some people talk about why the name 97%. That really came from a study that was done across multiple years of both gun owners and non-gun owners, which found that 97% of people across the board agreed with the concept of universal background checks, and yet we still don't have universal background checks. And as we dug in, what we found is that there are some nuances, there are some give and takes that can happen on both sides. There are things that people disagree on, and there are other components that people do agree on, and we should focus on where there is common ground and bring those policies to light. So our approach is really around 4 pillars. Next slide. And that is, number one, to conduct and share the research that we have, and that's part of what we want to do today. Number two, to create and support a policy roadmap around areas of agreement. Number three, to lead training, not necessarily nationally, but at the local level, to support the enforcement of rules that are in place and to make sure that first responders and law enforcement officials understand the laws and how to best enforce them. And where possible, to invest in technology that improves gun safety and reduces gun violence. And that's what we've been focused on since 2021. And I want to hand it over to Stacy Miller to talk about some of the research that we've done and the findings that we've had.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Adam. I'm just going to spend a couple minutes. As Adam mentioned, research has always been the foundation of 97%, and so I'm just going to spend a couple minutes talking through some of our research projects. As Adam spoke about, even before we started the organization, we did an exhaustive quantitative and qualitative research around gun owners. And what we found is about 85% of gun owners believed that there was an issue with gun violence in this country, but also believed that there was common ground that could be achieved across this issue and that real progress could be made. But we also found that gun owners felt alienated from the conversation, that they didn't think that their opinions were incorporated into policy and into discussions around this issue. So we knew there was an opportunity to bring gun owners into the conversation. And since that original work, every year we've collaborated with academic institutions, polling and research firms to really do very important data and research exclusively on gun owners. And the reason that we feel it's so important to do it every year is because the nature of gun ownership in this country continues to change. Post-pandemic in 2020, I think, as most people are aware, there were millions of new gun owners in the country. And there continue to be new issues that come about as it relates to guns and gun ownership. So when we first started doing this, ghost guns were not on people's radar. When we first started doing this, the Supreme Court Bruin decision hadn't been released yet. And all of these things, gun owners have very strong opinions and they have very strong ideas about what needs to be done to address some of these issues. So it's really important, we believe, every year to really understand and get the pulse on what's going on with gun ownership. And we use this information not just as a theoretical or academic exercise, but we actually use it to inform what we're doing around our policy roadmap, around our messaging, and around our training initiatives, which Chris will speak about a little later in today. So I'm going to spend just a couple of minutes highlighting a few of our studies. The first, which we will be hearing more about later today with Dr. Siegel, is the work that we did in 2022 with Dr. Siegel and his team. And what we wanted to see in that particular study is we wanted to understand which policies were both effective at reducing gun deaths and where gun owners actually had opinions and could support certain policies. So efficacy plus gun owner support. And we really wanted to understand where that intersection was. If we can move to the next slide. And what we found based on this research is we found that there was a belief among gun owners, a very clear belief that people who were violent or at risk of committing violence should not have access to firearms. And from this research, we developed a policy roadmap that had 3 key principles to it that, again, gun owners could support, but also would be effective in reducing gun deaths. Some of these things you will have heard about before, and some of them are important new insights into into what can be done. And what is incredible about this is based on the research that Dr. Siegel and his team did, and I know Dr. Siegel will be speaking about more later in the day, is that if we implemented these three policies together, that there was the potential for a 28% reduction in homicides and a 6% reduction in suicide rates. So very impactful policy. I'm just going to spend a moment talking about each one. The first is to set the threshold for someone not being able to access firearms at the violent misdemeanor level. So as many people are aware today, right now, you cannot have a firearm if you are convicted of a felony. The problem with this is that you could have been convicted of a nonviolent felony and you're excluded from firearm ownership. But if you are convicted of a violent misdemeanor, such as cyber stalking, then you are still allowed to have a firearm. And many gun owners pointed out that that doesn't really make a lot of sense, and that they felt that it's the violent component of it that should be the threshold for exclusion from guns. The second mechanism and policy is to combine gun permitting with background checks. And gun owners felt very strongly, again, that the emphasis should be on the behavior of the gun owner and not the gun themselves. And a combination of permitting with background checks, obviously vetting that somebody was safe, was focusing on that component of it and not placing an undue burden on gun owners. The third component of our policy roadmap is ensuring that those people who are at high risk of committing immediate violence in the future will not have access to guns. And that involves the implementation of red flag laws or extreme risk protection orders. Now, this last component here is something that's fascinating that we found with gun owners that was really important, which is it's the nuance that can increase or decrease gun owner support. So for instance, when we asked this question and included provisions such as there would be penalties if people vindictively tried to ask for an extreme risk protection order against somebody when there really was no merit to the case, that there would be penalties for vindictive requests for extreme risk protection orders. Gun owner support increased dramatically when that provision was put in place. And as I said, Dr. Siegel will be speaking at great length about this study later in the day, but it's really formed the foundation of 97%'s work and also where we think that there is the potential for common ground going forward. If we can move to the next slide, please. And I want to highlight one other study, our most recent study that we did. So at the end of 2024, 97% engaged in one of the largest standalone gun owner surveys. We surveyed more than 5,100 gun owners. And what the study revealed, consistent with things that we'd seen in the past, which is across the political spectrum, demographics, geographic location, that people felt very strongly that people who were at high risk of committing violence should not have access to firearms. And this study, we actually not only went into the policy level, but we gained insights around how to message around these issues. And we asked lots of questions from a political standpoint in terms of what candidates would people support based on what they their beliefs around this issue. And what we found is that candidates who supported common sense gun policy, they received the support of gun owners, and that there was in fact a lot of common ground there. If we can go to the next slide, please. So one of the most exciting things that we did as part of this work is we did a modeling exercise with the polling firms around one specific provision of the study. So this was around extreme risk protection orders or red flag laws. And so we took the survey data of the 5,100 gun owners and we combined it with individual voter level data so we could see the support for ERPOs at the state and congressional district level. And we saw some really fascinating results that I think didn't surprise us, but maybe are surprising and a bit counterintuitive. So what we saw is that every state in the country had greater than 50% support for ERPOs. And we found things that defy political expectations. So the county in the United States that has the highest level of support for ERPOs is actually in Texas. We saw states like North Carolina and West Virginia, who maybe have weaker gun policy, that in fact had the highest level of support for extreme risk protection orders among their populations. And we saw in states like California, which obviously has very strong gun laws, we saw among gun owners that there were actually pockets of slightly lower support than one would expect to find. We also found there are a number of counties, particularly in red and purple states in the country, that have Second Amendment sanctuary cities where there is a local desire not to implement certain laws like extreme risk protection orders. And we found that those counties, in fact, there was often the highest level of support among gun owners in those counties and districts for ERPOs. And this, again, is not just a theoretical or academic exercise. We use this information to understand how to message to gun owners, but also to educate politicians, legislators, and other organizations about support for extreme risk protection orders and to really better communicate their efficacy. And in fact, for 97%, these insights enabled us to actually launch a really important and brand new initiative. And so we had Detective Chris Carita join the 97% work. And he is a 19-year veteran of the police force and has really been helping, informed by this data and research, to lead the way on training of law enforcement and other key constituents around things like behavioral risk threat assessment and extreme risk protection orders. And I'm going to turn it over to Detective Carita to walk through the work that we've been doing in the training area. Thank you. Chris, you're muted.
There we go. So, good morning, everyone. I just want to start by speaking a little bit about law enforcement's relationship with gun violence over our history. You know, traditionally in the United States, law enforcement has been our primary response to gun violence. And for much of the country, that still remains the case. And there are innovative approaches developing in gun violence, like community violence interrupters, hospital-based gun violence risk screenings, and community-based cognitive behavioral therapy programs. And they're shifting our approach for the better. They're reducing our burden on the criminal justice system and providing us alternatives to our traditionally punitive response to gun violence. But successful iterations of any of these programs has required cooperation and buy-in from local law enforcement. Likewise, the gateway to most of these programs still remains law enforcement. Your first contact with resources in a violent crisis is going to be the police. Therefore, training and educating law enforcement through a public health lens and changing law enforcement's focus to one of prevention over response is our goal at 97%. Our first focus is on extreme risk protection orders, often pairing that training with behavioral threat assessment and management practices. You know, in 2018, the Marjory Stoneman Douglas school shooting in Broward County took the lives of 14 students and 3 teachers. And that incident sent shockwaves through the country. Later that year, Florida passed its own ERPO law in the hopes of preventing future tragedies. And my own agency decided to expand our threat response unit and make that team of detectives responsible for investigating ERPO cases. Well, I was part of that expansion, and I transferred in from our burglary and robbery unit. And in those first few months, we prepared to have constant confrontations with ERPO respondents. Our command staff was concerned with all the rhetoric around SWAT standoffs and people who would refuse to comply and surrender firearms under the order. But what we ended up seeing was the complete opposite. We developed a good protocol for speaking with respondents and gaining compliance. About 80% of our ERPOs resulted in a stipulation, which meant that the respondent accepted the terms of the order and didn't contest it in court. Most respondents understood, after good communication, that their behavior around firearms was reckless or dangerous or caused fear and concern in their families. And they saw ERPO as a fair response to that behavior. They cooperated with the order, and we would connect them to crisis services when that was appropriate. And then the majority expired without incident, resulting in the return of their firearms. Now, at the time, I knew something was different about these investigations, different than past work that I had done in law enforcement. And 3 months after serving my first ERPO, I happened to start the Master of Public Health program at Johns Hopkins through the Bloomberg American Health Initiative Fellowship. And through that program, I met Josh Horwitz, and Shannon Frateroli, and Jeff Swanson from Duke. And they're some of the original architects of ERPO. And as thrilled as I was for this experience and to learn from them, I was kind of taken aback at how interested they were in my experience using this tool. So through these relationships and my work at Hopkins, I developed ERPO training for my own agency. I began training neighboring agencies and hosting training at our police academy. And now, with 97%, we'll scale that training over the coming year to make it available to agencies in all 21 states that have an ERPO law. The goal is to concentrate on 10 states that we've prioritized based on either the need for resources or the availability of resources for healthy implementation. We've developed we're developing and implementing an outreach plan to build better relationships with those states. Our goal is to conduct training in at least 24 locations throughout the country. We're going to create additional training modules and materials, including online components, written materials, easy go-bys that will aid law enforcement making their decisions. And our goal by the end of the year is to launch a Train the Trainer program so that this can become self-sustaining. Our goal is to get this material out to as many agencies as possible so that they can then train their agencies and their communities and so on. Just to go back for a moment and speak a little more about behavioral threat assessment and management. Behavioral threat assessment and management is a protocol that was developed originally by the Secret Service and then expanded and to include other forms of targeted violence. And it was really focused on the recognizable behaviors that lead up to the majority of mass shootings and acts of targeted violence, even including terrorism. They include, the grievance, leaks, preparation for violence, and ultimately the attack. And what I have found is that those concepts of recognizing both risk, both the attributes of people that put them at higher risk for violence to begin with, along with the stressors in their life that may be pushing them toward violence, and then considering the mitigators, the positives in their life, looking at the totality of those circumstances. We intervened in cases, yes, of threats of targeted violence, but we were also able to intervene in cases using those same concepts of domestic violence to prevent suicide. So what we found was a lot of those same behaviors are also indicative of other forms of violence, and having those in mind was extremely valuable in teaching and implementing a good ERPO program. So that's our goal, is to kind of marry those two and also expand just the concept of prevention as a more broadly accepted ethos for law enforcement in our country. And with that, I'll hand it back to Adam. And we can go to the next slide.
Thanks, Chris. In addition to the work we've done around research and training, we also believe that there was an opportunity to leverage technology to help reduce gun violence. We scoured the planet to look for opportunities to leverage technology. There are many potential areas where technology can be leveraged to improve gun safety and reduce violence. But there were two in particular that we focused on and have worked with. The first one's a company called Vera Safety, which is led by Timmy O. And what they've done is accepted that for many gun owners, the primary purpose of gun ownership is the protection of their family. And in particular, there is concern about at-home break-ins. And so what we found in our research is many of those gun owners felt it important to have a firearm at the ready when they were sleeping at night. And so that meant if they had a gun safe, they weren't necessarily using it. They were keeping the gun near their bedside and having it loaded and available right next to them. The problem, of course, was to the extent something happened in the morning, they were late for work, something came up, they might forget to store that gun, and so that firearm would be available potentially for other family members to take and use. And what Timmy and his team came up with was accepting that that's the reality. And so if that's a reality, how do you create a better form of securing a firearm given those circumstances? And what they invented was a gun safe that's in the shape of a holster that can be affixed to a nightstand or bed frame, or interestingly, a car door, and leverages biometrics to release the gun. So it's effectively a smart safe. It only works with your fingerprint or the gun owner's fingerprint. It does not work with other family members unless they enabled it. And the lock is extremely fast. It takes microseconds to release. It actually is a spring release, so it pops right into your hand. And it can be left, the gun in that case can be left loaded right by the bed, but be secured. And these things are literally bolted on. It's almost impossible to remove the way they designed it, and has been very effective. There are now thousands and thousands of various safety devices out there. They're also working on a version of this for rifles, and they're working with law enforcement teams across the country to allow police officers and other law enforcement officers to affix not just handguns, but rifles. And what we thought was particularly interesting about Vera Safety is that it's backwards compatible. So it works with almost any type of handgun. There are different inserts you can use with the device. And so it works with almost all the guns that are out there in the market today. On the other side of the coin, but similarly around biometric smart technology, is BioFire. And so Kai Kloffer started this company back, actually thought of the company initially in high school, started it early in his college career, and then went full-time working on BioFire, and has released now the first commercially available smart gun out there, which again uses biometrics to enable the gun to fire. So the biometrics basically release the trigger and allow you to fire the weapon. But if somebody else were to pick up the gun, it would not work for them. And so these are obviously very interesting technologies. They are very unique. They're early stage as businesses and as technologies, but they work, they're effective, and we think they're going to increase their scale over time to help protect more and more people out there. So that's what we've been doing in technology, and we continue to look for interesting innovations that are out there to further gun safety while still protecting the Second Amendment. And so with that, we're going to turn it over to questions, and I just want to highlight that throughout the day, there'll be opportunities for Q&A and discussion. simply at the bottom of the screen, press the Q&A button, and you'll be able to ask questions. Dr. Siegel, over to you.
Adam, Stacy, Chris, thank you so much for sharing your amazingly innovative work that 97% is doing. Dr. Michael Siegel with the Tufts University School of Medicine, and we do have some questions. So the first question is for Adam or Stacy, I guess. The question is that more than half of the states now have permitless carry. And the question is, how many gun owners, based on your surveys of gun owners and knowledge of their opinions, how many of them do you think would be willing to go back to a handgun carry permit system? Indiana went to a permitless carry system in 2022, and it looks like gun violence and especially non-fatal shootings have gone up since then. Do you have any insights as to what do we do with states that have permitless carry, and can we get gun owners to agree to go back to a permit system?
So I'll share my thoughts on that, and then I would love to hear Chris's thoughts on that as well. So, as the question indicates, obviously in states that have permitless carry, when they implement it, we often see an increase in violence. And I think based on the research that we've done, I think that this is an opportunity where there needs to be some give and take with gun owners. So I think if gun owners are just asked to go back to a system and give up permitless carry, I do think that there would be some resistance to that. I think gun owners are concerned when these provisions are put in place, when they see increases in violence, but they do want to see some of their needs addressed. So for instance, we saw from gun owners that they don't like that if they're trying to legally pass a firearm down to a family member, that theoretically they have to go through additional barriers and things to get that done. They would like to be able to legally pass down firearms to their family members without having to jump through additional hoops. So I think that a lot of gun owners recognize that there's a problem when there's permitless carry, and are willing to have things done differently, but that there needs to be give and take in order for them to be more accepting of it. Chris, I'm curious if you, from a law enforcement standpoint, have any more insight into that question as well.
Sure. So, Indiana isn't unique in this situation. Missouri, I believe back in 2007, made a similar decision to repeal their permit program, and they saw a similar spike in gun violence and in non-fatal shootings that has continued, even comparing it to neighboring states. So Indiana is not unique in this. I think this issue has become unfortunately politicized. I think it goes to framing, right? So a lot of the framing from the gun industry is meant to scare people into believing that the government is somehow going to take their firearms away. So, but on the other side of that, we know from our research at 97% that local law enforcement, so not federal, not politicians, local law enforcement are trusted messengers when it comes to gun safety. So if we can get local law enforcement as champions of these policies and get them to speak to their constituents, to the people in their jurisdictions, to help them to understand that a permit program is a state and local program. It is not accessible to the federal government without a warrant. They can't just search and find out who has a gun. It is a state-run and locally resourced program. And I think if local law enforcement goes out and speaks on behalf of these laws and the benefits that they carry, I think there's a very good chance that Indiana could swing back in the other direction, especially in the face of the spike that they've seen, despite every other state in the country, on a decline since COVID.
Thanks so much for the responses. The next question for Chris is kind of twofold. One is, What are the states? Can you give us a sense of what states you're working with or targeting with the trainings? And is there a way for advocates out there in the field to collaborate on these ERPO trainings?
So yes, absolutely. The states that we are concentrating on, again, are a combination of the states that have resources available to improve their implementation. So we want to partner with those states and try to develop statewide programs. That's obviously going to be the most efficient way to scale this program and to get it out to as many officers as possible. But in other states, Florida being a good example, it's very localized. There is not a lot of state training around ERPO. There's one PowerPoint that FDLE puts out. The rest is up to each agency to build themselves. So in Florida, we're doing it piecemeal and building on the relationships that I've built over my career here. But we're also targeting California, Colorado, Delaware, like I said, Florida. We're targeting Hawaii, who does not have much infrastructure when it comes to gun violence. Illinois, Michigan, Minnesota, Nevada, and Oregon. So those are our top 10. That's our wish list. We're already engaged with about half of them. So that's the goal. And yes, if your organization is interested in knowing more about the training that we're doing and you're interested in partnering, we'd absolutely love to talk to you and figure out how we can bring this training to your state or to your jurisdiction.
Thanks so much, Chris. We have time for one final question, and that is, have you reached out to gun rights groups, and have you reached out to the NRA, for example? Are there some groups that are too extreme to really be brought into the fold? And I guess, what is your experience in terms of working with gun rights groups?
So the short answer is we have, from our inception, tried to reach out to gun rights groups. And I'll just a couple quick points on this. So there is a very small subset of gun owners who they're supportive of things like safe storage and gun training and things like that, but they do not want any additional policy or regulation. And those voices are often the loudest in the conversation here. And they're actually a very small percentage of gun owners, we found. But the perception is that they're a large group of gun owners because of how loud they often are. One of the things that I find most heartening about this work is after Parkland happened, several gun rights organizations actually, whom we had developed relationships with, reached out to 97% proactively and said, we're not sure what to do here. We're not sure what can be done, but we're not okay. We're not okay with what happened. We had similar outreach happen after Uvalde, where people were just very upset and didn't feel that things were okay. And we actually sat and we had a phone call with a number of different gun rights organizations. And we were able to communicate their perspectives to members of Congress. And, and I believe some of those voices were part of what eventually went into some of the Safer Communities Act information. So I think there's this perception that even most gun rights groups think that there is no common ground and nothing that can be done. And while that may be true for a very, very, very small percentage of people, we've actually found that that's not true across the board. And we found that a lot of collaboration can happen.
Thank you. Thank you, Stacy. Thank you, Adam, Stacy, and Chris, so much for sharing the innovative work you're doing and for sponsoring this important and I think unique look at this issue.
Michael,
yes.
could I just make one? I've seen a couple of questions. There's obviously concern in the current climate as to whether or not there'll be support for this type of work, for gun violence reduction. And I kind of wanted to speak on that just for a second and kind of remind everybody. The federal government has been mostly absent in gun violence reduction outside of law enforcement support for the past 20 years. And it's really only been in the last 4 years that we've seen actual federal support for gun violence reduction through the Safer Communities Act. That's actually an anomaly for the federal government to put money into something that's not a traditional law enforcement criminal response. So before that, states were the champions of change. State and local government has always been in this country the champion of change for gun violence and for gun violence reduction strategies, new laws. States were the ones to step out and say, we're going to try this ERPO law. And now we have 21 states who are protected by ERPO laws. More than half of the population is protected by ERPO laws. So as everybody goes forward and continues with this work that we're all so passionate about, because so many of us have seen the consequences firsthand, I want you to remember that what you do at your local jurisdiction, your cooperation and partnerships with your local law enforcement, your state officials, and the advocacy that you do right at home has a greater impact than you may appreciate when you're doing it. It may feel a little hopeless with all of the news and everything that we're seeing right now, but local folks, local jurisdictions, states have been the champion of change around gun violence reduction for most of our history. And that's the way it's going to be right now. It's going to take states stepping up and deciding to dedicate resources to this that the federal government is now going to start peeling back. And it's going to be up to local jurisdictions to keep moving forward with progressive policies that work and really push that forward over the next 4 years. It's going to be a hard fight, but it needs to happen.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chris. It's time to move on to our next panel. Chris actually mentioned the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, and that is a perfect segue into our next panel. And it's my privilege to introduce, as the moderator for the next panel, Dr. Harry Selker, who is the Dean of the Tufts Clinical and Translational Science Institute here at the Tufts School of Medicine. Harry, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. I am elated to join today for this conference. At Tufts CTSI, Clinical and Translational Science Institute, it's our passion to translate our best and evolving understanding of medical and health issues into impact on health in the real world. And translation and the impact on health is ultimately about translation into policy. And today we are diving into that, which on a very important topic. We will hear success stories of dealing with firearm violence and ideas that can drive better health into our communities and to our nation. Accordingly, I want to welcome you to our first panel, Translating Gun Policy Research into Action in Congress, a Success Story. Despite the polarization on this issue, in 2022, somehow Congress was able to put identity politics aside and pass a meaningful piece of bipartisan legislation. This was perhaps the first meaningful gun violence prevention bill passed by Congress since 1996, when Congress prohibited gun possession by domestic violence offenders. The Bipartisan Safer Communities Act expanded the background check requirements, prohibited gun possession by people convicted of assaulting dating partners, and provided funding for the implementation of red flag laws and community violence intervention programs. This panel will explore how it was possible to pass that bipartisan gun violence legislation. Each panel today will be started off by hearing the voices of those who are working on the ground in the community to directly prevent gun violence. These heroic advocates will serve as our keynote speakers today. The keynote speaker on our first panel is Pastor Corey Brooks, a visionary leader committed to eradicating violence and transforming lives on Chicago's South Side. He is the founder and senior pastor of New Beginnings Church of Chicago and CEO of Project HOOD, Communities Development Corporation. His academic journey took him through Ball State University, University of Florida, Dallas Theologic Seminary, and Grace Theologic Seminary. Welcome, and thank you for being here with us, Pastor Brooks. We are honored to have you speak with us today.
Thank you so much. I greatly appreciate it. And thank you for the opportunity you've given me today to deliver this address. I really appreciate it. Well, from the rooftop to real results, I want to talk about how community and policy came together to save lives. First of all, I want to say good morning to everyone. It's an honor to be with you today and help open a conversation that, quite frankly, is about life and death in neighborhoods like mine. I come to you not from the ivory tower of theory, but from the rooftop of a building on the south side of Chicago, where over a decade ago, I camped out for 94 nights in the dead of winter to draw attention to the devastating gun violence plaguing our community. And I just didn't stay there for media attention like some may have thought. I stayed because young people were dying. And I couldn't sleep in a warm bed knowing that blocks away, mothers were planning funerals. I stayed because I was tired of attending candlelight vigils, tired of telling parents, I'm sorry, tired of watching dreams bleed out in alleyways. I stayed because I knew we needed to build something stronger, something deeper, and more transformational than what had ever existed on that block before, a block called O Block, named after a young man named O.D. Perry, that the gangs took his name and started calling it O Block, but it's actually 64th through 66 and King Drive. It was there that I went up on that rooftop of an old abandoned motel, and that rooftop became a pulpit. And from that perch, we cast a vision to reclaim our neighborhood, not just spiritually, but economically, emotionally, and physically. That vision became Project Hood, helping others obtain destiny. Now, let's talk about guns. Let's talk about violence. Let's talk about change. The statistics you all study, we live them every single day. In my community, a gunshot isn't data. It's a child hiding under the bed. It's a grandmother ducking while cooking dinner. It's a student skipping school, not because they don't care, but because they're scared to walk down the street. That's why community violence intervention can't just be theoretical. It has to be relational. It has to be grounded. It has to be trusted. And that's exactly what we do. Here's what it looks like. We run violence prevention teams made up of credible messengers, people who were once part of the problem, but are now, we feel, part of the solution. Men and women who carry not only street knowledge, but heart knowledge. They're trained, they're embedded, they're walking the blocks, they're mediating conflicts. Sometimes even before they explode, they're intervening, they're saving lives in real time. We provide job training, entrepreneurship programs, mental health counseling, mentorship for young people. Most of those young people are at risk because here's the truth. If we don't give them a way out, they'll stay stuck in a continuous cycle of despair and destruction and decay. Presently, we're building a $45 million leadership and economic center on what was once the most dangerous block in our city. In 2014, the Chicago Sun-Times called the block that we're on the most dangerous block in Chicago. O Block, that's what the article said. Matter of fact, social media pundits all over America and even the world, they call our block the most dangerous block. And it's here that we're building this $45 million leadership and economic opportunity center, because we believe opportunity is the antidote to violence. And I want to be clear, we didn't do this alone. This is where the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act changed the game. That funding wasn't just a grant. For us, it was an affirmation. It said, we see you. We believe in community-based solutions. We understand that real change starts where the bullets fly, where the kids cry, where the parents are praying. Because of that support, we were able to expand our violence intervention team from 40 workers to 100 full-time members. People working every day to de-escalate and interrupt violence before it happens. We served over 4,000 youth last year, offering safe spaces, mentoring, education, rolling up our sleeves and helping them to develop plans for their own lives. We launched workforce development programs, training young men in construction and culinary arts and coding and more, giving them not just jobs, but a purpose. We even came up with a tagline, put the guns down and pick up a hammer. But I need to say this clearly. We're not done. This work is not about reducing violence by 75%, as we've done. It's about rewriting the narrative. It's about creating a future where young Black boys on the South Side of Chicago can grow up thinking about college and not caskets, weddings and not funerals. A future where single mothers are forced to choose between paying rent and paying for therapy for a traumatized child. And if we want that future, we can't just pass policy. We have to fund strategies that have been proven to be effective in a quantitative and qualitative sense, meaning we have to trust those who are closest to the pain because they are often closest, I believe, to the solution. Now, let me leave you with a story. A young man named Marcus came through our doors last year. He had been in and out of the justice system since he was 13, a shooter, a leader in his clique. When we first met him, he told me straight up, Pastor, I don't want to die, but I don't know how to live any other way. Thankfully, today, Marcus is alive, employed, going to school at night, mentoring young boys. His life has been transformed. Why? Because someone believed he was worth saving. Because we had the resources to walk with him. Because this kind of intervention was funded. So I stand before you today in front of this computer and as a witness and as a warning, as a witness and as a warning. This work matters. This investment matters. And if we turn away now, if we let this momentum die, we will lose more than money. We will lose the Marcuses of the world on the South Side of Chicago specifically, and all the others just like him. But if we stay committed, if we keep investing, if we let data inform our dollars and compassion drive our decisions, we won't just reduce gun violence, we'll resurrect communities. I want to thank you all for giving me an opportunity to share with you. I want to thank you for believing and thank you for giving us the fuel to keep fighting, the fuel to keep fighting for peace and for purpose and for a future for our kids that they so desperately deserve. And I want to invite you to the South Side of Chicago, where right now, as we speak, construction is going up for our Leadership and Economic Opportunity Center. That block called O Block is totally being transformed, and lives are being changed forevermore. I want to invite you to see what those dollars can do when they're put to work in the hands of organizations and people who really do care and who are producing and doing what needs to be done to change this tide on gun violence. God bless you, and God bless all of your organizations and all of you who are doing the work to make life better for all of us as American citizens. Thank you so very much.
Thank you very much, Pastor Brooks, for joining us with your words, wisdom, witness, warning, and work ongoing.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It is now my pleasure to introduce our first panel. We are honored to have two speakers who have played key roles in the successful negotiation of the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. First, we have T. Christian Heine, the Chief Programs and Policy Officer with Brady, one of the nation's oldest and most important gun violence prevention organizations. He leads all of Brady's legislative and programmatic efforts at the federal and state levels. Prior to this position, he served as the legislative director at the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence. Joining Christian is Rob Wilcox. Rob is the former deputy director of the Office of Gun Violence Prevention and Special Assistant to President Biden. He helped lead the first ever federal office, which was tasked with implementing the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, expanding partnerships with state and federal officials, identifying new executive actions, and initiating federal gun violence emergency response system. Previously, Rob served as senior director of federal government affairs at Everytown for Gun Safety, where he advised Senator Chris Murphy as he negotiated the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. Welcome, Christian and Rob. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for having me, for having us, and for the incredible work of and leadership of all of our speakers today. In particular, really honored to be able to and humbled to be following Pastor Brooks, and appreciate the incredible work that that he laid out, and I think the framing of sort of what it looks like to do this kind of work on the ground day in and day out. I am Christian Heine. I am the Chief Officer of Policy and Programs at Brady. I come to the work as a survivor of gun violence, and Rob and I were talking before this, and we decided to mix it up a little bit and to sort of have a conversation. I've been really blessed to work alongside Rob for many years, and was just blown away to be able to carry that work into in partnership into the work that he and Greg and Jackson and Steph Feldman were doing in the Biden administration. And I'm honored, as always, to be able to speak alongside him as well. So we're hoping that we can keep this a little conversational, and really what we've been tasked with doing is sort of describing the universe that that led to the passage of BISCA. We know that we can't do that by just talking about the negotiation of BISCA itself. So our hope is that we can go back a little bit and describe where the movement's been, how we got to that moment, and what we think is important as we move forward too. But I don't want to suck up oxygen. I think that it's more important to hear from Rob than it is to hear from me anyhow. So I'm going to kick things to him so that he can introduce himself too.
Definitely not more important, Christian. So I'm Rob Wilcox, and as I'm very grateful to be here and thankful for Michael and Tufts for putting on this important convening. You know, my journey to this work was growing up in Brooklyn, New York in the 80s and 90s between the Gowanus houses and Wyckoff Gardens. Seeing violence in New York, but not necessarily knowing the kind of world of solutions, and then was gripped when, you get the phone call that, the pastor was describing, and so many of us have received that a family member had been shot and killed. And, it was my beautiful cousin Laura, who was 19, home from winter break, and she was, not in Brooklyn. She was in Northern California, and a place that didn't see a lot of violence, but was volunteering at a local mental health hospital. And, one of the patients who stopped taking his medicine, who had accumulated firearms, walked in, put the gun right to her head and shot her dead, and killed others that day. I still remember the funeral sitting here today, like many of us have been to, and I can hear the music that was playing. I can see the space. I literally can see the dust and the sunlight that was kind of streaming in. And I remember seeing, as too many times, the pain. But I also made a promise to myself that I'd try to make a difference and carry on her legacy. And so I'd moved to DC. I was just graduating from Wesleyan University, fellow NESCAC school. showed up in DC thinking that I'd be able to work and try to focus on solutions. But what I was met with was, a Washington Post headline that with the election of George W. Bush, the NRA would work out of the West Wing. And I saw then a number of dangerous policies pass, and have continued that, this mission of mine for 20 years, and kind of started, for anyone listening that kind of wonders how you grow into the space. I started as an intern and I ended up at the White House. And so it's the passion, the dedication, and continuing to build our bag of skills that enables us to make, deep change. And, Christian, I don't know if you want to share kind of how you got involved. And, the truth is Christian's and my connection goes back 20 years. And so being here with him is incredibly special, special for me.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Rob. And yeah, just like Rob's laying out, I mean, so many people in this fight and in this work come to it because they've been personally impacted, and my story's similar in that regard. In 2005, my parents were just coming back from a holiday vacation. They'd borrowed a boat from my dad's best friend. They used that boat over the weekend, had an amazing time. Got sunburnt, ate barbecue, had our golden retrievers out there. And when they came back from that trip to return the boat to my dad's best friend, a man lay in wait to shoot my dad's best friend. And because my parents were there, they were shot as well. My dad, we're very fortunate, survived multiple gunshot wounds. But the last words my mom will ever speak, according to neighbors, were as she begged for her life. She ran about 10 steps and was shot and killed with a single bullet to the back. And, as we sort of picked up the pieces and tried to figure out what was going on and how this happened, how this individual had access to the weapons that he used, what we found is that the most remarkable part of our story is how unremarkable it is, and how, Brady was the organization at the time, once my dad healed physically and we were all trying to put the pieces together, where we really were trying to tackle those questions, and where I found my voice as an advocate, and small world theory or just the notion of our movement. Two of the survivors that really taught me how to use my voice, how we can shape policy and honor the memory of our loved ones, and how important it is not only to be policy expertise, experts in the space and the logic behind it, but really that our stories matter, are Nick and Amanda Wilcox, who is Rob's aunt and uncle, and they took me under their wing in Northern California. They're responsible for more than 100 bills in California, and when I had the opportunity to move to DC, also as an intern, shout out to interns, Rob, I was had a sense of the power of survivor voices in the space, and also the importance of policy, even though that work has expanded, and I'm really honored today to be able to carry on a lot of the work that they did at Brady. It's been an honor to not only continue to learn and work with them and support them now, but also to be able to have developed the friendship that we have, Rob, and the trust that we have in the work that we've done. One thing I want to say too, Rob, and I think you can highlight this as well, is BSCA didn't happen overnight, right? In our movement, and we've been doing this now, to your point, for more than 20 years, and we've been in DC for for more than 20 years now too, right? Or more than 15 years for me. But I think that, like, I'm looking at just how many people are here right now. We've got 160 people on this call. There were so many times back, in 2010 or before, where we would have more panelists than I think sometimes audience members, right? And I think, as we sort of collectively think about the challenges that we're facing right now in unprecedented times, I think as a movement, we also need to take note of just how strong we are as a movement, just how strong, how many voices are a part of this work, and how it wasn't just the efforts of 1 month of negotiation that allowed BSCA to pass, but really there was a period of time where we had to really grow and do that collectively, and that momentum has taken place over decades. And so I just want to know if maybe that's a good pivot point here of what was it like and when you came out to DC when you started this work, and what does that evolution look like from your vantage point?
I think where we were in the early 2000s is we were really without a lot of the tools we needed to make progress. Research into this issue had been effectively shut down in the late 90s, so we were basically working without the talent that exists in the research community. I think we very narrowly were thinking about policies as in like, well, let's just think about background checks and the amount of impact it could make, instead of thinking about the larger body of work we need to really address this crisis, not just the kind of interpersonal violence and the mass shootings, but also suicide and domestic violence. But what I saw was we didn't have a ton of strength, and although we had people who were impacted every day, we didn't have a way to channel that into a call for real common sense action. And so what I saw, and I'll kind of kick it back to you in a second, is, we moved through that decade of the 2000s, and then all of a sudden there was that horrible incident in Sandy Hook Elementary School where the country was really galvanized. And I think it was galvanized not just for that incident, but for a lot of the incidents we've seen. And people started really seeing gun violence as a crisis issue that had to be addressed because, as coming from a family of gun owners and a dad who was a Green Beret, and having met tons of different people, like, no one is in favor of violence and death. And I think that is the common ground that we start with. But unfortunately, politically, we didn't have, I think, either the ideas or the momentum to get stuff done. And so after that incident, there was a negotiation. There was a proposed bill called Manchin Toomey that would just focus on trying to address, background checks on gun sales made on the internet or at gun shows. There was, a lot of compromise went into that bill, and it only got 50 Democratic votes and 4 Republicans. And I just remember, Christian, like how many people were like, well, if we can't pass something now in this moment, we'll never see progress on this issue. But to me, what was amazing was that was a media narrative. Like that was what the media was telling us. But what we actually saw was the opposite. I think we saw more people start leaning in than ever before. And it was survivors, yes. And it was folks raising the alarm that this isn't just about a mass shooting. It was about everyday violence that's happening in our communities, like mine in Brooklyn, or as the pastor said, in Chicago. It was about, the targeted violence like Kristen, you experienced. It was the firearm suicide. And all of a sudden, we start moving forward. And we didn't just move forward with advocacy and on the ground, we moved forward with research. Back in 2013, I remember a research convening, and as you said, about 160, there was probably like 18 people, right? And I was just at a conference in Seattle a couple months ago. There was 850 researchers. And I kind of like wonder what you thought in that moment of kind of, well, where do we go from there? And I know you've been so involved in state work and local work, but just kind of wonder how you absorb that moment where, the media narrative, certainly, first of all, there was the pain of defeat, but there was also this media narrative of, oh, we're not going to do anything. And I just kind of wonder how you took that moment.
Yeah, I mean, I think we had known for so long logically that we were doing the right things, right? That the policies that we're advocating for didn't conflict with what the American people wanted. We just couldn't break through to get them to care, right? Enough to make it a priority issue. I think that I remember hearing Andy Goddard once say, who his son Colin survived the shooting at Virginia Tech, that all of these shootings that we endured, and that includes, it's certainly the moment that you're talking about at Sandy Hook. It wasn't that's not when the gun violence prevention movement started, but it was a galvanizing moment where all of these siloed efforts, particularly people who've been doing this work for so long in isolation, where we sort of started to say, hey, we got to collectively come together. And I think the way that Andy described it is like there was all these drops in the bucket of, the daily luge of gun violence, all of the firearm suicide that we've seen, but also what we just witnessed on TV that we never saw in any other industrialized country, Columbine, Virginia Tech, all of these different shootings, Aurora. And then when Sandy Hook happened, you saw the faces of those 20 children and the 6 educators, and the bucket spilled over. And I think that the American people collectively said enough is enough. And I think that's when it became a priority for folks. But I mean, we got to keep in mind, like in 2011, when we were here looking at a vote for what was still the NRA's, it's still the NRA's priority today. It was their priority then, for a bill that would mandate concealed carry laws throughout the country to just make it so that people can carry weapons loaded in public, regardless of what their existing state law is, and lower the bar to the lowest common denominator. We were talking about permitless, even people could just carry weapons in public. That's their priority today, but it was also their priority in 2011. And when that vote came down, it wasn't just a party line vote, right? We saw 1/3 of Democrats in 2011 vote in support of that NRA priority. In the first term of Obama's administration, the 2 bills that he signed expanded where you could carry weapons. You could carry them into national parks. You could carry them onto Amtrak. And so that moment, it was really disheartening to see. But to see a bill be brought forward onto the floor, to see Vice President Biden be the person gaveling at the Senate as a mark of how important that moment was, to see, by the way, a majority of senators, right? We saw 55, a bipartisan showing, 55 who were essentially ready to go on this, to support it. It did feel different, and so we felt disheartened, but we were really glad that people said enough is enough and we got to do something. And I think what has been so amazing in the time after that is that the momentum continued to build. And we did sort of say, we can't just rest on federal policy. We need to look into communities. We need to invest in communities, right? There's so many Black and brown leaders that for so long have been leading and building a public health model that is we know works when you address root causes. It works to prevent generational cycles of gun violence, and bringing that to the forefront as an idea that we need to embrace collectively, not just background checks, but more policies. And we need to follow through by implementing the policies that we are passing. I think a robust state effort to be able to, hey, what is it that works? Let's go do some case studies and pass robust state laws so that we can protect people there, but also that we can build the case for why we need these things nationally. And that's why the provisions in BISCA are built from the wins that we stacked up in the scoreboards, right? And on the state policy front as well, and the fact that we know that if you live in a state like California that takes this comprehensive approach, you're 30% less likely to be shot if you live in that state. That's a remarkable thing, right? The states that have robust laws now resoundingly have lower gun death rates. All of that, I think, has built the realities. And the last thing I'll say is, Sarah Brady used to say that the people who were standing against us in Congress were either didn't have enough courage, didn't have enough heart, or didn't have enough brains, right? And I think that what we've proved is the brains, right? We've shown that this stuff works. We have the heart because people are on our side because they know that we don't have to live this way. And then there's the piece around politics. And I think that one thing that's really been remarkable is our movement's grown, right? Like, we've taken on the NRA in a lot of places. We've shown that if you run on this issue courageously, you can win. I'll never forget that election in 2013 in Virginia, where the NRA is headquartered. And for so long, people said, you can't run on guns in Virginia, you'll lose. And across the ticket with McAuliffe, Herring, and Northam, they all leaned in and ran on guns, regardless of what the conventional wisdom said. All these people saying, don't do it, don't do it. And I'll never forget that not only did all 3 of them win, but Mark Herring, who had the closest election that cycle, his campaign manager wrote an op-ed to say, hey, by the way, we didn't win in spite of our position on guns. We won because of our position on guns. That this resonated with voters. People are fed up. You got to buck what the pundits are telling you, and meet voters where they're at on these issues. And I think we have consistently been showing that time and time again. And ultimately, that's the political environment that was able to put you at the negotiating table, which I think people really want to hear about. Put you at the negotiating table when we had this moment in time to really try to bring forward the most comprehensive gun violence prevention bill that we've seen get signed into law in nearly the last 30 years. So, with all that history that we're describing here and everything that we've sort of taken to build out, I think, and I want to hear about it too, Rob, but how exactly did those negotiations come to be, and what was it like as the discussions were progressing and moving forward? What was it, such a unique moment in time, and I know that you had a really unique purview into it. I'm just curious, what was it like sort of sitting at that table, and how did you get there, and how did the conversations kind of permeate?
Yeah, I mean that kind of takes us into that moment, and the truth is, it's the credit goes to Senator Murphy and Senator Sinema, Senator Tillis, Senator Cornyn, two Republicans, two Democrats who kind of sat down after the horrific shooting in Buffalo, which was kind of a racist attack on a grocery store that was killing grandmothers, to another school-based incident in Uvalde, where you had, again, beautiful young children just in the right place at the right time, school, shot and killed. And I think that kind of energized and activated folks to see if we could have a conversation. But that conversation doesn't happen without that 10 years you were talking about, Christian, where, I think about 700 laws were passed, new funding sources identified, people talking out loud about the need, not just to focus on the firearm, but to focus on the outcome. How do we actually prevent this violence from happening, and using the research to kind of pass the full suite of laws? And so when when I got to the negotiating table, it's because, Senator Murphy's staff kind of reached out and said, we want to talk about, this negotiation. We want to hear kind of, what ideas you have. And so I got to talk to them and then to him, and kind of heard his vision. And really what was so impressive in that moment, that was a Friday after the shooting in Uvalde, was that the negotiation wasn't just going to be about one policy. It was going to be about 6 or 7, and it was going to include significant funding for mental health, school safety, community violence intervention. I think that was the biggest difference in what we did in 2022 versus what had been tried ever before federally, right? Federal gun policy was always about just focus on, is it background checks, or is it, so a loophole here or there? Is it, assault weapons, right? And then those are very narrow, critically important, debatable, but narrow solutions. And so when Senator Murphy went into that negotiation, it was thinking, well, how do we really try to do it all? Let's not make this a mental health or guns. Let's not make it a school safety or background checks. Let's not make it mass shooting or community violence. It was really, how do we get something that will make advancements across the board? And so what we saw was looking at a whole host of policies. So there was a discussion about background checks, a discussion about domestic abusers who have access to guns, a discussion about individuals under 21 who we know have perpetrated the worst mass shootings in this country, a discussion about what about, these red flag laws that can be used with due process to get firearms out of the hands of the people who are in crisis. What can we do about funding to make sure that we are making dollars available for school safety, for mental health, for community violence intervention? And the negotiations talk about 5 or 6 weeks, but I think, when I think about why I was successful, is because every day we had something to work on, right? Every day those senators, if there was a loggerheads in one place, they can move to another. And so each day provided an opportunity to kind of push forward. And I think that was what was so key. And with each of those policies, there was history. And I think that's another second most important thing, right? So the red flag funding, $750 million for implementing state crisis intervention programs, including red flag laws or extreme risk protection orders. That didn't just come up that day, right? There was a hearing, I think in 2019, where my aunt testified, and it was chaired by Senator Lindsey Graham. And it was about, well, how do we have a process that actually can enable us to take steps in action when there are clear signs of crisis? And that hearing, and then the bill that was introduced by Senator Graham and Senator Blumenthal, bipartisan, begin to build that record. And going back to the states, after the horrible shooting in Parkland, Florida, they passed a series of bills. One of them was, one piece of it was a red flag law in Florida. And what we saw in Florida was wide adoption across the state, Republican sheriffs leading the way. And, Florida's done more red flag laws than anyone else, 20,000 to date. And so, and we had the research looking at how a red flag law can really save lives in that self-harm moment. as well as, stop mass shootings. And so you have those pieces, right? State action, research, bipartisan movement in Congress, even if it didn't lead to outcome, meet us at the negotiating table. And so for each of those provisions, those stories exist. The domestic violence provision, where we kind of tightened the law around domestic abusers, saying if you're a boyfriend, a dating partner convicted of a misdemeanor crime of domestic violence, well, then you should be blocked from possessing and purchasing guns, which was a gap in the law. But it didn't start there, right? That was a provision that had bipartisan support that almost made it into the Violence Against Women Act reauthorization. It was something that we saw red, blue, and purple states take actions on. And we had research showing that kind of blocking firearm access to domestic abusers makes a significant difference in reducing homicide. And so you had some of that momentum where you had bipartisanship, you had state action, you had research. And I just think that when you looked at each component, you had that kind of special sauce of, well, do we have some proof from the states? Do we have some research? And have we already begun some conversation? And then you move to the funding side. And I think too often as a movement, folks got a little too narrow and they didn't realize just how critically important. And the pastor spoke directly to this, right? The influx of funding. And so under the last administration, we put $400 million into community violence intervention. And it was a drop in the bucket before that, but in just the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act alone, it was $250 million. But that, again, that built off the work on the ground that the pastor and others are leading that was being under-resourced, but had great evidence behind it as being effective. It came to a number of states beginning to unlock dollars, and it came because we had made some bipartisan progress before that. There was $50 million in an appropriations bill a couple years before. And so we were able to show that these things are happening in a bipartisan way. There's strong evidence behind them, and they really lead to the results that everyone at that negotiating table was focused on. How do we keep kids and communities safe from gun violence? And so it was a kind of a whirlwind of 5 weeks. But I think those were the two main pieces that went into the kind of success was the senators being willing to open the aperture and look at multiple policies and funding. And then behind each of those, there was a strong body of support from the states, from research, and from bipartisan prior negotiations. And so I think that's one word of advice is even when we see things and feel like Congress might be letting us down, we're not making the progress we want in the moment. That's part of a continuum, right? That's part of a timeline. I think the last thing I'll say that made a big difference is that we actually started people calling for action. In 2013, when we couldn't pass the law, I remember there was one senator, she was a Democrat, who said, I love this bill, it's common sense, but I'm getting 7, my constituents, though, don't want it. I'm getting 7 calls telling me to oppose it for everyone to support. So even though I think it's good policy, good faith negotiation, I can't get behind it. In 2022, a Republican senator literally told the opposite story. He said, I like this policy, it is good. And one of the main reasons I'm going to vote for it is I'm getting 10 constituent calls to support it for every one telling me not to. And I think that is also part of the magic is we're getting people engaged to demand this type of action because we know it can work. And that means we got to be living in this space of what can we get done that we know works, that we know has a track record, and that we see that has kind of bipartisan support. Because the alternative of doing nothing, not investing in solutions, and not using these tools, it just is. It's never going to make our communities safer. But Christian, I know like passing the law, that was huge, right? That was a big moment. But I'm sure you thought the work wasn't done at that point.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I do want to piggyback on just a couple points that you're making because I think it's really important for us to remember in these times, right? Because we have work ahead. There was a lot that we learned in sort of making sure that what was accomplished with BISCA was solidly there. But there's so much that you're referring to that I think folks need to really hold on to, right? Like a lot of the wins that you're describing, it's not like we only are turning on the violence prevention work when there is a Democrat in the Oval Office, right? Like when you talk about things like extreme risk protection orders, the bulk of those laws that were passed in states, that happened during the Trump administration, right? Like that happened in the wake of horrific shootings when states said enough is enough and they're going to do something. And this is something that will really ensure that we temporarily get guns out of the hands of individuals in crisis and can prevent tragedies from happening. And once again, like 5 Republican governors in the wake of Parkland signed those bills into law. And I can even remember at one point, now Attorney General Pam Bondi sitting in a room with President Trump and talking about the power of extreme risk orders, right? And the way that policy that was passed and signed in Florida, how it is working, with due process to make sure that they're protecting people. I mean, the incredible progress that was made in a lot of the community violence intervention, were investments, sometimes by private, sometimes by states themselves, but a lot of the research that was done to sort of show the efficacy about it is what built the case for when BISCA move forward. And I am always moved in a story that I heard is like, you covered a lot, I think, Rob, about sort of once again, I'm going to use the brain, the heart, and courage, right? The Wizard of Oz theory of Sarah Brady. But we had the moral high ground because of the way that people felt after not only all the violence that we see day in and day out, but then to see the shooting in Buffalo, to see the shooting in Uvalde, and just knowing that something had to happen. We had the brains because the policies that we had been working, and we had the evidence to show that. And we've done that in the States. We had done the work, we had built it. That piece about courage is worth noting too, right? That the morning of that vote, the NRA and the NSSF, even though they had been included in these negotiations, they opposed the legislation. And we heard John Cornyn stand up and say it's just not a part of their business model, but still move forward and voted for it, right? Alongside 15 Republicans and Mitch McConnell. And there's a story that's told about a caucus meeting where Republicans were together and polling was shown to these about frontline Republican districts, like about each and every one of the policies they were about to vote on in BISCA. And each of them were wildly popular, even in these deep, deep red states. They were saying, look, the numbers don't lie. We need to get on the right page on this. We need to get on the right side of history. Here's why we're bringing this forward. And somebody raised their hand in that meeting and said, why are you making us do this? If I vote for this bill, I'm going to piss off. No, if I vote against this bill, I'm going to piss off my constituents. If I vote for this bill, I'm going to piss off the gun lobby. And that just speaks to the incredible power that we've built, that in Republican caucus meetings, they're coming together to say, don't put me in a position where the American people, my voters, my constituents in these deep red places are going to be upset with us, or the gun lobby is. And at the end of the day, it was the American voices, the American people that won that back and forth. So I think, it shows sort of this holistic picture, but we got to do it in the down times, right? Which is sort of what we're in now. And I think also one lesson that we really learned, which I think you were asking about, Rob, which is just because we pass laws doesn't mean that lives are saved. We know the potential that it can have. We know that these policies work, but there's a whole nother bucket around implementation that has to be prioritized if you want these things to be effective. And so much of what we learned in the States, not only through the research of where things are working, is where they didn't work. And part of the reasons oftentimes that these policies didn't work is because there wasn't this intentionality behind making sure that funding and training are being put in the right places so that these policies and tools can be effectively utilized, right? That the infrastructure of making sure that people know about extreme risk protection orders is critical for the states where it works the best, right? And making sure that law enforcement is well trained and well versed in exactly, this is a brand new process, this is a civil order that law enforcement have to proactively go and get oftentimes when they're in large part used. How do they do that in the right way to make sure that they're really focusing around protecting somebody, right? We're not creating new, with something like the extreme risk protection orders, we're not trying to create new avenues of criminality. We're not trying to arrest people. What we're really trying to do is just protect them in those moments of crisis. And that requires a lot of thinking about things differently and how they traditionally handle the calls that they're getting. And so, what was so wonderful, I think, about all of the negotiating is that we had that in mind, right? When we were having conversations, when you're having conversations at the table, when I'm talking to other offices, when the NRA would try to push back or weaken or water down things or try to say that these, orders don't maybe have due process or they don't work because of XYZ, we just are too smart as a movement at this point to accept that, and we were able to push back in effective ways, and as a result, this was pretty strongly worded and was really effective language. But also there's real money in there to make sure that the tools could be utilized, to make sure that states could use them, to make sure that states could do the things that are going to be required to most effectively train folks up the right way, and also make sure that the right community groups are getting the funding, and that the right kinds of programs are doing the right things to look upstream and prevent this violence from happening. And so I think that shows how sophisticated we've gotten, but it also shows that how different our movement is today and what we focus on than maybe what we did back in 2010, right? Or 2013 for that matter, that we just know more because of what we've built. And as a result, we know how important the times are that we're in now, because there's still work being done on the ground that's going to inform what it is that we're able to pass 4 years from now, 8 years from now, 10 years from now, whatever it may be. This is not one and done. We have to continue the work in the states so that we can build the case for the next opportunity we have. And so I know that the White House in particular was focused on this, and we got just as a time check, we got about 8 minutes. All right, Rob, so I'm gonna be good on time here. But one of the things you were really charged with was sort of how do we robustly implement VISCA? And so after negotiating, after seeing it work in the states, after trying to tee ourselves up for the best possible outcome there and make sure that things are implemented robustly, what was it like then to shift into the Office of Gun Violence Prevention and really try to hit this home, right? We've helped build the bill. Now we got to go make sure that it goes out the right way. And I just am wondering, what was that experience like, and what did you learn while you were doing it?
Yeah, and I think I'll try to hit some highlights since we got to get to Q&A, but from where I started in that headline in the Washington Post to where I ended up was sitting in the Rose Garden with my friend Greg Jackson on the right and my kids on my left. And instead of the NRA working out of the West Wing, in just 20 years, what we saw was our movement sitting at the highest levels of power. We saw gun violence survivors and policy experts get a chance to do the work inside government. And so we were tasked by the president to really do 4 things: implement the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, come up with new executive action ideas, build partnerships at state and local and community level, and build the first ever federal gun violence emergency response system. Because too often we'd see incidents of concentrations of community violence or a mass shooting, and communities left to pick up on their own. There was no FEMA to show up to actually help organize some federal support for the community. And so we took those and ran with it. And when it came to the Safer Communities Act, we kind of did a hard assessment of what progress has been made to date, what are the kind of gaps that we had to focus on, and then what were the opportunities to make sure we were letting people know. And so we kind of focused very intensely for every provision, kind of where were we in the regulatory process, where were we with funding, and making sure that we were maximizing the benefit of that law. And so what did that mean in practice? And I saw some of the questions about bringing together gun violence prevention and community leaders and other sectors. That's exactly what we did, right? And we made sure that gun violence prevention wasn't just about gun policy. It was about upstream root cause prevention. It was about intervention before there was suicide, mass shooting, community violence through efforts like the pastors. It was about response. How do we make sure that law enforcement has the tools they need to solve homicides and non-fatal shootings? And it was about recovery. How do we help those who've been exposed to violence, impacted by violence, get resources to heal and to get back on track? And so with those 4 big charges, we both came up with new ideas and we implemented this law. And so, one piece was that law made the single largest investment in youth mental health in history. $1 billion to hire and train 14,000 new school-based mental health professionals. States are pulling down that money. That estimate comes directly for them. There's still 2 years left of that funding, though, $400 million. I really hope it goes out. It should go out. It's been appropriated, but that's a big question. And why wouldn't we fund school-based mental health professionals? We were very fortunate to have true leaders at the Department of Justice using the community violence intervention money with intention to make sure that it was getting to the ground and the groups that were in need of kind of sustained funding to do the violence intervention work. When it came to the red flag dollars. You know, what we saw when I got there, there was only one state that was actively using it. And so we really got to work to focus on how do we raise awareness? How do we educate? The vice president who oversaw our office really leaned in when we went down to Parkland, Florida, to challenge states to use those dollars. And we went from one state to 14. You know, how do we utilize the new gun trafficking law? So it's not just about a kind of individual, you know, prosecution. It is about how do we get upstream more, and we use that law as a gun trafficking and straw purchasing law to bring over 600 cases. And you know, folks at NYU who I'm working with are actively assessing that now and looking at all those cases to learn what we can about prosecutions of traffickers and unlicensed sellers, both to reflect on what we did, what we could do better, but also to make sure that we shine a light that that's the kind of work we need the federal government in. And when it came to new actions, we really took an all-of-government approach. You know, within the first week of us being there, you know, we got there, the Rose Garden ceremony was incredible. The next business day, I was filling out HR paperwork to like who my beneficiaries were and getting my key card and being told not to use Signal. And I was just, you know, it's like, oh, this is a job. But then like that afternoon of our second day, they were like, there's going to be a cabinet meeting in a week. The president will charge every agency to lean in and do more. And you got to help bring ideas to them. And so, you know, at first you hear agencies like the Department of Labor going, oh, what do we have to do with an assault weapon ban? And we kind of said to them, that's not what we're asking, actually. What we're asking is, how do you help us with economic opportunity? And they said, oh, well, we have, you know, these grants that are for summer youth employment. And we said, well, summer youth employment is a significant factor in reducing youth violence. And so what they did is pivot that grant program to give priority to communities where there was youth violence so that it could be invested in those communities. We went to HHS really focusing on the healing aspect and how do we provide those resources for survivors? How are we thinking through, you know, after you've been exposed to violence, you can get both the physical help you need, the emotional help you need, but also how do we really truly take a hard look that gun violence is one of the leading causes of newly disabled Americans? That's a health issue. That's not a criminal justice issue. And then when it came to going upstream, we really challenged ourselves to get beyond the old way of thinking. You know, for example, and there's been some reporting on this recently, like there are these things called auto sears or switches. They're small pieces that go on the back of a handgun. It converts to be automatic, could fire 1,000 rounds in a minute. And everyone's solution was, well, let's, you know, really crack down on whoever has one. And we said, well, let's focus on where they're coming from. And what we uncovered as an administration was there was websites where you could just go online and buy 10, 20, 30, 40. We found 350. Every single one of them was based in China. And so what we did is use civil asset forfeiture law to shut down those websites. Now they're coming back online. There needs to be more work to focus on it. And I guess like at the end, Christian, there was a lot of policy. We moved $40 billion to invest in solutions. But I think to the pastor's point earlier, that is not the measure of our success. The measure of our success is what is the impact being felt in community? How are we saving lives? And, you know, very proud to tell you all that is as dire as it seems and as painful as this issue is, when we run this playbook, we will have success. 2023 saw the steepest decrease in homicide in history, nearly 12%. 2024 saw about a 16% reduction in homicide. Cities like Boston, I know Tufts is close. Boston saw a 78% reduction. Literally 24 people were killed in Boston in 2024. There's 4 times as many people on this call that were murdered in Boston. And as the pastor said, that doesn't mean the work is done, but it means that we have a playbook we can run for success. And so I think our challenge for all of you on this call, and Christian and I feel this in our bones, is now is not the time to back away. It is the time to double down. And we went from 1 statewide office of gun violence prevention to 14, 20 local offices to 120. And we have more laws on the books, funding available, allies in office to run this playbook. And so that is our challenge, is how do we not just let this comprehensive all-of-government approach be put on the shelf? How do we, in fact, use it to invest in communities, invest in, you know, safe gun storage, invest in going upstream to block the access to guns, invest in healing, and do the things that we need so that we don't see this trend turn around? Because as the pastor said, these aren't data points. Christian and I know it fully well, that these are the difference literally between funerals and weddings and birthday parties and visits to cemeteries. And so this work can't be more essential because it is not theoretical. unlike a lot of other issues, it truly impacts lives. And so I'm very grateful to spend this time. Harry, thank you for giving us the chance to kind of go a little bit down memory lane, but also hopefully bring people up to speed to where we are and the challenges we face, because there were some questions. And this administration has broken down the CDC's Division of Injury Prevention. We should not expect to see funding, the community violence intervention funding that the pastor knows is so important. I don't know that that program continues or how it continues. And I don't know that they're going to have the energy to focus on the ghost gun companies that were making these dangerous products versus individuals. So, our challenge is not just to despair in the ash and rubble that's left, but to take our work to the states, to continue running the playbook, and to prepare for how we rebuild government when we get power back, which we will, to truly address this public health crisis. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much, Rob and Christian, for sharing your stories, both the ones that motivated and drove you, but also the story of the crucial work you did in DC as midwives to such an important bill. Congratulations on that wonderful and rewarding work. We have great questions in the Q&A box I want to get to, but I have to, just to link to what you were just saying, take the prerogative of asking you the first one, which might connect your work to those in the audience. And that is, for those who are not in DC, but maybe visiting there or are working from their homes, what actions would you advise them to undertake to advance the cause of reducing firearm violence?
It's a great question. I think, it's where I ended. Demand that your local and state government be rebuilt to address this public health crisis with prevention, intervention, response, and recovery in mind. Our governments have been built to solve yesterday's crime instead of today's public health crisis. And so I think that's challenge one. Demand your government run this playbook, establish strong Office of Violence Prevention, incorporate the work of intervention work, both at the community level and the suicide prevention level. So I think that's huge. And then you can do that at your school board level, at your local government level, at your state government level. So that's one, is really ask yourself, is my government, local, state, hyperlocal, doing the thing that we know is most effective?
Yeah, I think there's a misconception that your voice is going to get lost in the shuffle. But what I think we are trying to sort of tell, and what we learn through BISCA and other processes, that your voice matters. And and it's not just, your voice at the kitchen table matters when you're home at Thanksgiving, talking about these things in real terms, so that it's not sort of bumper sticker logic, but hey, shouldn't we try to keep guns out of the hands of domestic abusers? Shouldn't we invest in communities so that we can address root causes and create long-term success? That these are the kinds of really popular ideas that in the moments when those offices, Joni Ernst wrote that op-ed that Rob Wilcox was describing, right? And there was a provision, that domestic violence provision, that she had resisted in the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act for the year before. And just 2 months after she got that out of VAWA, she voted for it in this bill, and it's because her constituents called her. So your voice matters. Even if you talk to an intern that picks up the phone, they take note of it. It makes a huge difference. And then also just what we're saying, that policy matters, but what happens on the ground matters more. And I just want to give another shout out. I'm sure Pastor Brooks can talk way more about this, but the tangible ways in which, groups like Project Hood are having a tangible impact in where you live, that's going to be a real way that you can tangibly have an impact in the violence that communities are experiencing. Ensuring that there's funding for incredible groups to be able to do that work is really important too. So it can't just be about background checks. It can't just be about calling your legislators. It also has to be about getting involved in the places where people are most vulnerable to this gun violence occurring day in and day out as well.
Pastor Brooks, you spoke to that already, but if you want to add, please.
Yeah, I think it's really important that we remember exactly what they've said, that we not only deal with the legislative part of the theoretical issues, but it's important that we deal with the ground issues as well, because even as we change laws, if we're not impacting a change of mentality and a change of hearts, people will find something else to use in order to commit crimes, in order to do violence against people. So it's important that we fund things as well, not like he said, not just on background checks, but we fund things that help to transform people's lives, because at the end of the day, that's what's going to make things different, especially in inner city in America. I can't speak to a lot of the other issues, but one thing that I know so very well is the violence that goes on day to day in the inner city. It cannot be changed without the resources that are needed to help people to change their mentalities.
I mean, let me double tap that, Pastor, because the worst thing we could do now is walk away from the programs that save lives. And that means we need state government, we need local government, we need philanthropy to step up. And we got to prioritize where we are putting dollars. Like we're not going to be able to fill the gap of the federal government, but underfunding community violence intervention would be literally the biggest mistake we could make. And I think you're getting at this too, but I can't say strongly enough that in our communities, Harry, the question, you say that goes in the budget. That is an essential. That is co-producing public safety, right? We cannot walk away from that.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And obviously we were always sorry just a couple of weeks ago to see that office closed in the White House, which is the wrong direction. I note that we have 9 fantastic questions in 10 minutes. Actually now 9 minutes. So I'm gonna look for concision, but these are all great. The first one is, in the development of the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, what was that really first brought the Republican legislators to the table? What was in it for them?
I mean, what was in it for them was, for Senator Cornyn, the terrible incident in Uvalde happened in his state. And, not too long before that, there was another mass shooting in Midland, Odessa, Texas that deeply impacted him. And that was an incident where, a person tried to buy a gun and was denied, found someone online who was, selling 15, 20 AR-15s. And he didn't like that. He kind of said, this is a problem, that if you can't buy a gun legally, you can't just go find someone online who would sell it to you. I think, Senator Tillis, being from North Carolina, saw that there was issues in Durham and Charlotte and did want to kind of respond in a responsible way. And so I think though the incidents that they've lived through and the calls from their constituents is what brought them to the table. And I think what led us to success was we didn't enter a negotiation, Senator Murphy, to his credit, saying it's all or nothing. It's passing an assault weapon ban or I'm walking away. It's saying, let's make some progress across issues we could find common ground.
Yeah, that also reinforced your earlier comments that people can do things. The next question is, we're siloed in how we address the issues. In this case, opportunity in one silo and guns in the other. How can we heed the message of Pastor Brooks and raise opportunity as a critical part of the gun violence solution? Aren't partnerships between the community, the gun violence prevention community, and human development leaders essential?
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I mean, there's never been a more important time in my work, I think, where I really feel a call to link arms with everybody who's going to be impacted by what we're facing today. And, there's a lot of things that, I once heard Anthony Smith, who's an incredible leader at Cities United, say this, but, there's so many factors that go into gun violence, right? And it impacts everybody's lives in some way, shape, or form. And it's not just about a policy around how you get the gun. It's not about the gun. It's about, housing. It's about funding. It's about access to mental health services. All the things that we're sort of talking about what makes a comprehensive approach. And that we as organizations are the ones that tend to silo the issue and be like, it's about this thing or this thing, right? The only way that we're going to be able to move forward and find that rising tide that lifts all ships is if we're willing to sort of get outside our comfort zone, sometimes step outside our lane. Don't take up space if you're not the leader in that space, but certainly find ways to partner with the people who are trying to work towards the same objectives as you, because that's how we're going to find success. I think that's what makes our movement stronger. It's as a individual, I've not always been great at this, and I always reserve the right to get smarter. And I will continue to try to challenge myself to keep learning at it. But I think as organizations, we need to do the same thing, because that's how we are going to find ultimate success. I think it's what's grown our movement into what it is today, and we need more of it, not less of it, especially where we are today. So yeah, I think it's a really great question and an important tactic of the work that we do.
There's a bunch of related questions here. I'll try to kind of slightly lump. The first part of it is the Office of Gun Violence Prevention Act. it's a bipartisan effort led by Congressman Frost and Senator Murphy to reestablish the Office of Gun Violence Prevention in the DOJ. Is there any sense of tempered optimism given in the current political climate? And then
No.
there was also two questions that I'll just kind of add into this, where there's a concern, warranted, I'd say, that there might be clawing back of these funds by the current administration, and what might be done to mitigate that.
There's no chance that's going to pass in this Congress, even though I do think we have allies. They tried to defund our office, actually, in the House of Representatives, and Maxwell Frost called me and Greg up and was like, "We did it, we blocked it." And I said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "They tried to defund your office, but thanks to 9 House Republicans, they didn't." And I do think people see the value of this work because of how we've shown up in community to help heal. But no, I don't think that's going to pass right now. And there's an important question, though, of like, how do you have an office at the White House and the governor's level and the mayor's level that can help kickstart this work, right? Make sure that pastors at the table, make sure the human development's at the table. But how do you make it a permanent part of government? That's a big question still to be answered. And then on your second question.
What the clawback of the
Oh yeah, that is a very real concern. We are seeing that already. What we need is people to help groups on the ground that are going to be impacted, because I don't know that it's legal of what they're doing, and we got to help groups prepare, especially our community violence intervention groups that have been awarded multi-years of funding. We have to help them legally to make sure that those contracts are honored. But we're seeing funding being clawed back, kind of in multiple ways. That's real, and I think the best thing we can do is, one, shine a light on it, that you're defunding community violence intervention, you're defunding law enforcement, you're defunding health approaches, and we have to, use the legal tools we can to protect, because those are contracts, right? Those are awards and those are contracts.
Are there legal paths already in your mind about if, in fact, those monies are impounded that will work to be sure that they're still used?
Yeah, my friend Amber Goodwin has started a legal community to specifically help community violence intervention organizations, examine litigation and litigation options. And I think there's a strong collection of attorneys general who are one of our best resources in this moment, who are standing up against unconstitutional, unauthorized actions, from closing the Department of Education to impounding funds. So those are the two things that I'm aware of.
There's
I
so
think
many
also
questions
the
and so
point
little
you
time.
made earlier, Rob, too, about like this idea of like, we have to do everything we can to try to preserve, to protect, to talk about what's happening, to shine a light, and do all that stuff. And also, states need to step up. Philanthropy needs to step up. There's accountability abroad, and I know that there's a lot of different spaces and places where people are having conversations about what works. We were very lucky to be able to not just incubate through these efforts, but really show what's in the realm of possibility. Now it's on us to hit these other intermediaries, right? These other experts, to make sure that everybody knows that now's the time to, once again, don't walk away, don't back away, double down. We need everybody at the table, and we need accountability across the board. We can't just rely on the federal government to move this work forward.
Well, this is killing me not to put all these questions to you all, but I'll give you just one last one, which is here, and that is the questioner asks, do you think the gun lobby still holds the sort of power that they once have? How do you think it'll break down, given their financial situation isn't what it used to be?
I mean, look, the passing of the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, all the evidence you need.
Yeah.
The implementation of that law faithfully, effectively, to save lives is the story we have to be lifting up. And the truth is, I was going to end with this, Harry. It's like the White House was transformational. I think of the effort we put in, the playbook we developed, that has to go out into the world. But for those in this moment who are dispirited, I will tell you, in my heart, the White House was never a destination. The White House was a vehicle to advance this work. Our challenge is to find the other vehicles that will help us advance this work. Getting dollars to pastor and those on the ground, rebuilding governments where we can. Our job is to find those vehicles, not to bemoan that we have lost one.
That's right. And these bills have a life afterwards, such as the Affordable Care Act has, and so forth. So it's not one and done. It's a continuing struggle. Thank you so much for all your work, both in Washington and in Chicago. This This has been an enormously helpful panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Pastor, I'm coming to see you. I'm taking you up on an invitation.
I look forward to
and if I
seeing
could
you
say one
guys.
more shout out here too, right? The power of survivor voices, right? I just want to, like, in particular, Rob's done given a lot of flowers out. He's talking a lot about this, but I just want to say the power of the whole of government approach that we saw is the fact that people who have been directly impacted, that know that we're not talking about numbers, that know the lifelong ramifications of what gun violence looks like day in and day out, and that trauma, it requires making sure that we're putting survivors forward. So I'm so thankful to Rob and Greg for carrying that. I'm so thankful to hear about your work, Pastor Brooks. I agree. And also really, I hope folks bring survivors into the conversation, not just to tell our stories, but to really contribute to the work that's being done day in and day out. I think that's what really made a difference in what we've seen here.
Thank you.
Well, with that, thank you again very much. We now have a break, and they'll put the timing, I think, on the screen, and I look forward to seeing you back in about 10 minutes.
You guys.